I see a suit of armor around the world.
I now possess the power to establish a perfectly content, perfectly ordered world, all under the benevolence of my iron will.
Hey, welcome back, ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Harriet, and we're all still reeling from the announcement that Robert Downey Jr. is back in the MCU, but not as Iron Man, but as my all-time favorite Marvel character, Dr. Doom. One of the key elements of this casting that I think we can all agree on is that this version of Doom will most likely be a multiversal variant of Tony Stark. A Tony Stark who went on a very different path in life and became a very different superhero, or should I say, supervillain. Someone who is very different from the Tony Stark that we know. So we're going to take a look back at the history of the MCU's Tony Stark, and we're going to pinpoint the exact moment that this version of Tony Stark may have strayed from the path of a hero and became Dr. Doom. To do this, we're going to comb through the entire history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and look back at every single moment that Tony Stark could have made a life-altering decision that could have changed everything. Because what is the theme of the multiverse saga if not choice, and how the choices we make can change everything about our lives? So we're going to start with some of the more simplistic options, and then we're going to work our way through the timeline chronologically to some more devastating possibilities. And before we get rolling, guys, I want to thank Alpac on YouTube for suggesting that we make this video to begin with. We love getting suggestions from you down in our comment section. Please let us know what you think of this video so far. What if this Tony's alternate path in life began before he was even born? A timeline deviation that resulted in Tony being born into very different circumstances. Perhaps Howard Stark never became the success that we know him to be in the mainline MCU. Perhaps he never joined S.H.I.E.L.D. This would alter Tony's path in life big time. I mean, after all, Howard Stark was quite the womanizer in his youth, so maybe during World War II he hooked up with a European lady and then she gave birth to this variant of Tony Stark. Or maybe the path diverged not before birth, but at a young age. Tony Stark was born into privilege, but imagine a universe where he didn't grow up with that privilege. Imagine a scenario where, like, the Stark's plane crashed over the mountains of Latveria. Latveria being where Dr. Doom rules as a king in the comics. I can imagine a universe where the Starks were targeted early on by Hydra and their plane was taken down in that region, and a young Tony Stark may have been the only survivor. Remember, as we learned in Captain America Civil War, Tony's parents were killed by the Winter Soldier who was sent by Hydra. But what if the Starks were targeted earlier on? Imagine a universe where their private jet is shot down and crashes into the mountain. A young Tony crawls from the rubble and sees shell casings for missiles that brought him down, and on them is his own family name, echoing this shot from the first Iron Man that greatly affected Tony's direction in life. Young Tony could be believed to have died in the crash, but really he was taken in by locals from Latveria who gave the young boy a new name, Victor Von Doom. This young genius could have worked his way up the ranks and turned this small village into a technological marvel and eventually become the ruler of their kingdom. Or we could see Hydra step in after the plane crash and take the young Tony and corrupt his mind from a young age. And maybe it's Hydra who gives him the new name so that no one knows that Tony Stark survived. With the influence of Hydra, Tony could have taken a very different path in life and eventually worked his way up their ranks as well. And in either of these scenarios, we could still see a young Tony, or young Victor rather, go to university in the United States, go to MIT, and there he would meet and become rivals with Reed Richards, who in this universe has taken Tony Stark's place as America's poster boy genius. One thing I really hope they keep in the MCU is Doom's actual greatest weapon, his propaganda. Doom isn't just a supervillain, he's a monarch, a head of state, and this grants him diplomatic immunity. But also, the people of Latveria have been raised to revere him as a god, because that's what happens when you only get your news from one source. And sadly, that's actually how we tend to consume media in our own lives. We follow the sites that confirm our pre-existing bias, while most of those outlets are driven by profit and are just trying to keep up engagement for higher ad revenue. Guys, we are at a critical time in our country's history, and I think that we can do better. So if you want to cut through the bias and hear the real news, I recommend Ground News. They're the sponsor of this video. I use Ground News every day. I like it so much I subscribed on my own. Or what the heck is it? Ground News is an app and website that gathers related articles from across the world into one place. But they give you the context about the source's political leaning, their reliability, and their ownership. This means that you can see through the bias and think critically about the news that you consume. For instance, here's a huge story about the prisoner swap with Russia that brought home tons of people to the United States. Left-leaning and center outlets focused on Biden's words that this was a masterpiece of diplomacy, while right-wing outlets tend to focus on Trump's criticisms of the deal and claimed that the deal was slanted in Russia's favor. Especially with the election coming up, I want to be informed, and I want to know that the news isn't isn't trying to sway me one way or the other. So they even have a blind spot section that shows you news stories that each side is ignoring. Like, I did not know that Elon Musk agreed to fight the president of Venezuela, or that Kansas stopped enforcing a law against impersonating election officials. This is an incredible resource, and I've been looking for a service like Ground News for years. I highly encourage you to check them out. So if you go to groundnews.com/ScreenCrush or click this QR code, you'll get 40% off their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to every feature. Or you can try their Pro plan for less than $1 a month, which is totally worth it. Your subscription will not only help our channel, but you'll also be supporting an independent platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. Now, back to Doom. In the comics, Reed Richards and Victor Von Doom were intellectual rivals from a young age. This rivalry predated their ascendancies to becoming a superhero and a supervillain. The Tony Stark from the mainline MCU did not have a Reed Richards to challenge his genius. Our Tony Stark didn't really have any peers that rivaled his intellect. He was largely regarded as the smartest person on the planet, a title that's typically given to Reed Richards.
I'm the smartest man alive, Reed Richards.
But what if, in a universe where Tony Stark and Reed Richards both existed, these two innovators came up together and became rivals? We know that the upcoming Fantastic Four takes place in another universe, a universe that is far more advanced technologically than the MCU. So perhaps Tony's intellect wasn't as highly regarded in this universe. Tony wasn't regarded as this boy genius with competition like that of Reed Richards. And maybe that leads to Tony becoming more defensive, more aggressive, and becoming more determined. This could exemplify bad characteristics from the pre-Iron Man Tony Stark, such as his arrogance, his support for militarization, and, overall just being a bit of a jerk.
The day weapons are no longer needed to keep the peace, I'll start making bricks and beams for baby hospitals.
You rehearse that much?
Every night in front of the mirror before bedtime.
This universe's Tony Stark could easily go down a path that doesn't lead to Iron Man, but the path to becoming Dr. Doom. Doom, who was always an overconfident, competitive bully. It would also make sense that in a universe where Reed and Tony both exist, they would at times be colleagues. And, like in the comics and in the films, Doom and Reed could acquire their power at the same time via the same space catastrophe. And this could be when the vain Tony Stark receives his facial scarring. In the comics, Victor has scarring on his face that his vain nature won't allow him to accept, so he views himself as a monster. If a young Tony Stark is injured, perhaps in an incident he blames Reed Richards for, I could easily see him taking a villain turn and becoming Reed's arch nemesis, Dr. Doom. I also want to take a moment to share with you guys our awesome new Doom-inspired merch that we have up for sale in our merch store right now, ScreenCrushMerch.com. We've got RDJ in the classic Obama Hope poster design, but it says Doom instead of Hope. We've also got the Somehow RDJ Return shirt, plus many other fun shirts about Deadpool and Wolverine, Marvel, Star Wars, and many more. Shopping the store is the best way to support our channel so we can keep making videos for you like this one. Thank you so much for your support. Now, of course, one of the reasons that Tony's father, Howard Stark, was killed by Hydra was because of his association with S.H.I.E.L.D.
Clearly, you know my dad better than I did.
As a matter of fact, I did. He was one of the founding members of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Now, Tony never really knew his father, not well anyways, so what if that hadn't been the case? What if there were a universe where Tony did know about his father's involvement with S.H.I.E.L.D., and if instead of pursuing his father's footsteps and becoming CEO of Stark Industries, he instead joined S.H.I.E.L.D.? We could have seen a scenario where Tony Stark grew up and matured a lot sooner than he did in the main MCU, a Tony that had his hero turn long before the events of the first Iron Man. In fact, this Tony Stark may have never even been kidnapped by the Ten Rings and may never even have become Iron Man. Instead, he would have worked his way up the ranks of S.H.I.E.L.D., surpassing even Nick Fury and become the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And here is where it gets interesting. Something you'll notice to happen in multiversal type stories is recurring themes and events that ripple throughout time. I think some of the things that we saw happen to Nick Fury would instead happen to Tony Stark. Nick Fury suffered a pretty brutal face scarring in his younger years, resulting in his famous eye patch. So I'd imagine that if Tony Stark became director of S.H.I.E.L.D., perhaps it would have been him who obtained that facial scar. Perhaps one that required a larger covering than just a small eye patch. Another thing that burdened Nick Fury as the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. was his sheer knowledge of the threats to humanity.
We have no idea what other intergalactic threats are out there. S.H.I.E.L.D. alone can't protect us.
This knowledge made Nick Fury embrace weapons of mass destruction and preventative measures that jeopardize people's rights of privacy. Now, Tony also went down this path after the events of the Avengers, and that's what resulted in the creation of Ultron. But what if Tony had gone down that path a lot sooner in life, and as soon as things got worse and worse and the world became more and more at risk, we could have seen Tony go the path of a villain. Not a mooah villain, but like an I'm doing this to save the world, I know better than you type of villain, aka a villain like Dr. Doom. So, like we mentioned earlier, Tony's parents were killed when he was a teenager, but it wasn't until Captain America Civil War that he learned that it was the Winter Soldier who killed them.
Did you know? I didn't know it was him. I just did you know? Yes.
But what if we saw a Tony who reacted to the deaths of his parents very differently? A Tony who was hell-bent on revenge. A Tony who solved his parents' murder years earlier and knew it was the Winter Soldier who killed them. This would have led to Tony discovering Hydra much sooner, as well as discovering that S.H.I.E.L.D. was infiltrated by Hydra much earlier on. We could have seen Tony use his weaponry to annihilate Hydra, kill Bucky, and take over S.H.I.E.L.D. Once again, taking on a villainous type role, falling victim to his preventionist mentality that we have seen plague Tony throughout the Infinity Saga.
Preventionist?
Yeah, Tony and Fury both kind of fell victim to being burdened with great knowledge. The knowledge of how screwed mankind would be if they were attacked by outside forces. This type of fear can push good people to do bad things, all in the name of protection. Okay, so now we have finally arrived at Iron Man. So let's say everything we know about 616 Tony Stark happened exactly the same way it always has. He's giving his weapons presentation in the desert, the 10 Rings attack, you know the drill. But what if, in the process, Rhodey was killed? Rhodey, as you all know, is Tony's best friend. Without Rhodey's friendship, Tony would be a very different man. So imagine a scenario where the 10 Rings killed Rhodey in the midst of taking Tony hostage. Tony's moral compass would be gone. He would be emotional and erratic, and even more so set on revenge to take down the terrorist organization that killed his best friend. Instead of Tony having a life-changing experience that turned him into a hero down in the cave, he could have had his villainous turn. In the main timeline, Tony shuts down his weapons manufacturing and views himself and the military-industrial complex as the problem that creates and incites these terrorist organizations in the first place. But in a timeline where Tony is hell-bent on revenge for the loss of his friend, a reality where he never takes a moment to look in the mirror and have some self-reflection in that cave, this could create a Tony who becomes even more determined to create even more weapons to wipe out any and all potential threats across the world. And this could put Tony at odds with Captain America, who, remember, had this to say in The Winter Soldier when Nick Fury showed him S.H.I.E.L.D.'s new weapons and surveillance technology.
Thought the punishment usually came after the crime.
We can't afford to wait that long.
In the main timeline, Tony changed for the better, but in this timeline, we see him changing for the worse. And honestly, this could have happened even if Rhodey didn't die, because it was the character of Jensen who truly turned Tony Stark into the hero we know and love.
Don't waste your life.
Had Jensen not been there, or had Tony not listened to his dying words, Tony could have taken that experience in the cave and used it as an excuse to become an even bigger Hawk.
A hawk? Oh, like he becomes Hawkeye?
No, buddy, a Hawk as in a war hawk, someone who seeks out conflict and views it as the only solution to the world's problems. Instead of shutting down weapons manufacturing, Tony could have doubled or tripled their weapons output. We could have even seen Tony begin to rub up against committing genocide in the name of world peace. Jensen said to Tony with his dying breath,
Don't waste it.
meaning don't waste his second chance at life. You could easily see a scenario where Tony took those dying words very differently and committed his life to ending terrorism in a very different way, a very doomful way. Plus, come on, that original Iron Man suit would be dope as a Dr. Doom suit. And the same shrapnel that got lodged in Tony's heart could have also scarred his face, once again playing into the vanity and insecurities of Tony, just like Victor Von Doom. We could see a Tony who is so physically and emotionally scarred from his time that he never leaves the Iron Man armor. Tony Stark may have been the one to enter the cave, but in reality, he never really left it. In a way, the armor becomes symbolic of that cave that is keeping Tony trapped in the darkness, and the armor symbolizes the constant torture and turmoil a villain like Doom would live in. This turning point in the cave that created Iron Man was a situation that I could see creating a villain far more times than it would ever have created a hero. And I'd love to see a flashback in Avengers Doomsday that gives us that montage of Tony Stark becoming Doom after his time in the cave, as opposed to him becoming Iron Man. Hell, we could even see Doom referred to as the Iron Man. But let's reset. Let's hop back to the main timeline. Tony goes the path of a hero after his time in the cave, but his next crucial turning point arrives just a few years later, the attack on New York. In the Avengers, we see the Chitauri attack New York City via a portal in the sky. S.H.I.E.L.D. moves in to nuke the city.
You have a missile headed straight for the city.
Tony Stark is able to catch the nuke and send it through the portal, defeating the enemy and saving New York. But What if he failed? What if that nuke hit the city? Well, I think that we would have seen Tony Stark riot. Characters like Captain America would be dead. Black Widow and Hawkeye would be dead. Millions of people would be dead. And Tony Stark would blame himself for not being able to save them. As much as the incident in the cave in the first Iron Man movie was Iron Man's origin to becoming a hero, I would argue that the Avengers was really the moment where Iron Man became a full-fledged superhero. Prior to the Avengers, Tony had really gone up against demons from his own past. The Avengers was the first time Tony became a truly selfless hero. But in a timeline where he failed, I could see all of that crucial character development going down the drain. Tony would likely use all of his power and influence to expose and destroy S.H.I.E.L.D. for their transgressions against humanity. And we could see him pursue a vision of a suit of armor around the world so something like that would never happen again. But let's say that didn't happen. Let's say Tony is able to save the day and he throws the nuke into space. Well, after that came Iron Man 3, where we saw Tony suffering from severe PTSD.
How did you get out of the wormhole?
Wait a minute, Tony. Tony.
I think the close call in New York and the realization of the threats beyond Earth's atmosphere could have been a turning point that led to Tony once again taking a more hawkish approach. And if someone like Pepper had actually died in that movie, that could have been the final nail in the coffin that truly sent him over the edge. Instead of destroying all his suits and scaling down his Iron Man operation, he would have likely ramped up his operations and begun his Ultron protocol much earlier. In Age of Ultron, Tony envisions a suit of armor around the world. He is enchanted by Wanda, and he is likely influenced by the presence of the Mind Stone. And what if Ultron had actually worked? What if instead of becoming this rogue AI, Ultron actually became this almost omnipotent servant of Tony Stark? Tony Stark would be in possession of an Infinity Stone and the most powerful AI perhaps in all of existence. And with that much power, you're almost certain to be corrupted. We could see a scenario where Tony's suit of armor around the world becomes a reality, and Tony would feel vindicated. This could create a world where superheroes are no longer needed, and the Avengers are no longer needed. Tony's creation of a police state that sacrifices freedom for protection would be something that's right up Doom's alley. In fact, Tony's Ultron bots would serve as the perfect Doom bots. This could set up a similar conflict to the one we saw in Captain America's Civil War. We could see Tony and Cap go head-to-head in a war of freedom versus safety. And what if Tony wins that war? What if Tony wins the fight and he kills Captain America? He kills the symbol of freedom. Hell, Tony killing Cap could have happened in Civil War anyways. So let's say that Age of Ultron panned out the same way. Ultron goes off the walls, the Avengers assemble to take him down, yada yada yada, Sokovia Accords. Cap and Tony are at odds. Tony finds out that Bucky killed his parents and that Steve knew all along. What if, in this brutal showdown between the three, we see Tony get the upper hand and kill Bucky? I think killing Bucky in cold blood would have fundamentally changed Tony forever. And if Tony had taken it a step further and killed Steve Rogers, well, then there's no coming back from that. In this scenario, Tony likely becomes the leader of this new government-approved Avengers. Once again, sticking with our theme of Tony falling victim to his tendency to want to control the world in order to keep it safe, just like Dr. Doom. But let's take another step back. Let's say Civil War pans out the same way as it did in the main timeline, except for one little difference. Tony never forgives Steve. Maybe Steve even scars Tony's face during the battle, and Tony has this physical scar that represents an emotional scar that he cannot unsee. Perhaps, in this world, Tony continues the pursuit of Cap and the other Avengers, becoming an ipso facto villain for the Avengers. And there's also the Spider-Man Homecoming option. Let's say Civil War ends the same. Tony somewhat lets go of his beef with Cap, but then Peter Parker is killed, whether it be the incident on the ferry or his battle with the Vulture. The death of Spider-Man, a 15-year-old kid that Tony brought into this fight in Civil War, would be another life-changing moment for Tony. Peter's death could reopen the scars from Civil War and result in Tony rejoining the cause to put a check on superheroes, and it would also inspire Tony to take another crack at his suit of armor around the world. But not just around the world, but on every street corner and every dark alley. Tony says to Peter that the Vulture situation was below the Avengers' pay grade, but after that same threat kills Peter, Tony can make it his mission to police every level of society, once again creating the safety versus freedom conundrum. So in Infinity War, this is a movie where Tony loses almost everything. Almost. He loses the fight with Thanos, he loses Peter, he loses half of all living beings in the universe, but he doesn't lose Pepper. So what if in Avengers Endgame, when Tony arrived back on Earth, he was greeted by Steve Rogers, but no Pepper Potts? In those 5 years after Infinity War, Tony hung up the armor for good. He accepted defeat and focused his life on Pepper and their daughter Morgan. But in a world where he suffered great defeat, lost Peter and lost Pepper and never had Morgan, I think that creates a very different Tony Stark. I know we keep coming back to this well, but it's true that Tony's biggest flaw is his mentality of only I can fix it. Steve Rogers was able to humble Tony and make him into a better hero. But in Endgame, even with Pepper alive, Tony had this to say to Steve following their defeat.
Tony, I'm gonna need you to focus.
And I needed you. As in past tense. That trumps what you need. It's too late, buddy.
Tony was angry with Steve, and Tony felt vindicated, and I think that without Pepper, Tony would fall into his same obsessive behaviors. He would lock himself away, take another crack at creating something like Ultron, and be hell-bent on making sure something like this never happens again. Now, you would think that regardless of Pepper being there or not, Tony would go that path either way. In fact, with Pepper and Morgan, you'd think Tony would be more determined to make sure something like this never happens again. But here's the thing, in a world where Pepper blipped, Tony wouldn't have that buffer keeping him from falling into his obsessions. And lastly, guys, we have Endgame. We have.
I am Iron Man.
Now, this was the moment that Tony Stark cemented his place in history as Iron Man, the hero of the MCU. He made the ultimate sacrifice. He didn't cut the wire. He laid on top of it.
You're not the guy to make the sacrifice play. To lay down on a wire and let the other guy crawl over you?
I think I would just cut the wire.
But imagine a timeline where Tony didn't make that sacrifice. Imagine a timeline where Tony did not make a selfless decision, but a calculated decision. What if Tony took the time to use the power of the Infinity Stones to first empower himself, to upgrade himself to be able to withstand their power? What if Tony took this opportunity to not only destroy Thanos and his armies, but to create a suit of armor around the world? Hell, around the entire universe. What if Tony Stark took this ultimate power in the palm of his hand and used it to shape reality to his liking, just like Thanos? What if Tony allowed himself to become corrupted by this absolute power? This could not only show us a situation where Tony Stark becomes like Dr. Doom, but instead God Emperor, the Doom we see in Secret Wars, the most powerful version of Doom, a Doom who ripped Thanos' spine from his body. In a world where Tony didn't die after using the Infinity Stones, you can easily imagine a scenario where Tony doesn't let go of that power. This can make him even worse than Thanos in the sense that Thanos, as crazy and genocidal as he was, he thought that he was doing the right thing, and he didn't have an interest in holding on to the power of the Infinity Stones after his mission was complete. Tony Stark, however, who did become a selfless hero in the end, could have easily taken a very different path and allowed his old self to resurface. He could have reclaimed that mentality of only I can fix it. And with that type of power in the palm of one hand, doomsday is inevitable. So guys, those are our moments from the MCU timeline that we think Tony Stark may have splintered off and become Dr. Doom, or at least Dr. Doom-like. Did we miss any crucial moments that could have taken a very different run? And what's your preference for how Tony Stark becomes the MCU's Doom? Huge shout out to Colton Ogburn, who wrote this video. He's the guy who's trapped in our television but doesn't know it, so please don't tell him, and you can find his socials below. And let us know what you think down in the comments or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.